Before we begin today's show, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Posh Virtual Receptionists and Axiom. Welcome to the Modern Law Library. I'm your host, Lee Rawls, and today I'm joined by Kim Wehle, author of the new book, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why. Kim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lee, for having me. So happy to be here.
So, Kim, you have written 3 books, and your newest one, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, is a follow-up to What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, and How to Read the Constitution and Why. So I love that you're out there explaining things that I hope we would know from civics, but we don't always. What made you focus on this as your mission, almost, to communicate with the public about the law, voting rights, and then in this book, how you think like a lawyer?
Well, it really started early in the Trump administration when I was reading a piece in the New York Times that just sort of made an off-the-cuff statement that the president's pardon power is unlimited. And that prompted me to write my first op-ed that sort of pointed out that, there isn't really any unlimited power in the Constitution. That is, the president in theory couldn't pardon only people with, or Caucasian, for example, on that basis and evade a constitutional challenge. I'm not saying it would survive, but to say there's anything unlimited in the Constitution, I said, well, maybe we need to clarify that. So I wrote my first op-ed in the Baltimore Sun. And then, frankly, Lee, after having taught sort of separation of powers type classes for over a decade, these issues were sort of ripping from the headlines in the Trump administration over and over and over again. And so I started writing more, and then I got picked up on radio, and then I got picked up on television. And I'm under contract with Cambridge to write a very scholarly book about outsourcing of government power and whether the Constitution applies to that, and realized that I found myself writing a different book. I was literally typing through my fingers a different book. And it was my first book on the Constitution, realizing that civic literacy is really a problem in this country. Stunning numbers, a third of Americans who in 2015 couldn't name the 3 branches of government, and 10% of recent college grads who thought Judge Judy was on the United States Supreme Court. Those numbers actually have creeped up in terms of constitutional literacy more recently, but it still is a problem. And the key word in the title of all of my books or words is the and why part, the and why. If you understand the why, you can understand the what. So even in the way I think civics is taught, and I have children, so, I've experienced that to some degree. It's content-based. Memorize this, memorize that. So really the books are designed so that people can understand why we have a separation of powers. Why people say no more kings? What does it mean? And why do we have a politicians accountable? So the book sort of walks people through the Constitution from a very common sense standpoint, right? So, you might own a restaurant and hire the best people possible with tremendous integrity, but you still have rules and procedures. And if they violate those, you're going to fire them and find someone else because you need to have the restaurant stay open, right? And the government's exactly the same way. Finish book number 1, then, frankly, it seems like I should know this as a law professor, but it really, really hit home in my mind that the core heartbeat of the Constitution is voting, and that it's all about issuing tickets for speeding, right? If there's a speed limit out there, and there's no ticket for blowing through it, we all have had that experience where we'll just drive right, 10 miles over or 15 miles over because no one will notice. But once there's a camera in the bushes, people slow down, and the camera in the bushes for politicians is the ballot box. So that was number 2. And it frankly also stunned me that there's no affirmative right to vote in the Constitution, which we can talk about. I think that's a huge problem and why we're having so many problems across the country with voting rights. But then when I finished that book and we had sort of all the challenges with COVID around access to the ballot box, and then of course the big lie about a fraudulent election when there's very little fraud, and then the January 6th insurrection. The next phase in my thinking on this, frankly, as a scholar, is that, a lot of our problems are due to polarization and this team mentality, our way of thinking in a team, backing up our team. I'm on team blue, I'm on team red. And whatever the circumstances, I'm going to back my team. And lawyers think really differently, as you know, and it takes weeks to disabuse students for 1Ls of the notion that it's about finding the answer. Lawyers are about finding the questions. And once you find the questions, you have to identify relevant facts, and you have to exhaust the arguments against you, because if you don't, you're going to lose. And you also have to take into account policy, which we would call value systems. So that was this book. It's a long answer to your question. The new book, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, is a bid to get us back to respectful conversation that's based on verifiable information, and in a way that we understand that we're not going to all agree on everything all the time, and we're going to have to give some stuff up in order to live in an amicable, realistic way going forward.
Well, something you may find edifying as you and I have this conversation is that I am the daughter of two lawyers. So as I was reading your book, I'm like, this is some parts of this. I'm thinking to myself, this is why you got grilled after you got home at such and such a time. Or this is why when you were deciding where to go to college, everyone sat down and outlined an argument. And so that certainly, as I read the book, I was like, yeah, this is how at least the lawyers in my life.
It does change how you think. It does absolutely change how you think. That's a cliche, but law school does that. And, some of us take it a bit too far and cross-examine our friends and family. But it makes you smarter, not in terms of your cognitive capacity, but in terms of looking for flaws in your position. And I realized with the third book, there's nothing out there for regular consumers and, on the sort of Barnes and Noble, Amazon market that teaches people these skills that people pay a lot of money for. And if you're ever really in trouble, you need to hire a lawyer. And of course, you can't get a law degree from my book, but it approaches problems in a different way. And to the earlier point, really the objective is to try to change the dialogue. And let me just give one little anecdote, which really gave rise to the book. In the middle of the Trump presidency, I did a semester at a different law school. I teach at University of Baltimore, but I did a visiting semester at American University, Washington College of Law. And I was given a seminar that was called Democracy at Risk. So it was in the catalog as Democracy at Risk, but I could teach whatever I wanted. And at that point, I happened to be under contract with CBS News to cover Trump's first impeachment procedure. And I was on air with Nora O'Donnell and others. And they also had Jonathan Turley on, who's a GW law professor who tends to be more conservative, on the conservative end. And we were in this posture where we would sort of debate what was happening in a very respectful way, of course, but I think that's how it was set up. And so it was a very polarized time in the country. And I went into the classroom and brought those issues into the classroom. How this matters in the Constitution. And the thing I did was I asked the students to come to class with every class having considered 2 points of view on whatever hot button issue we were talking about. And I gave them some ideas as to where to find reliable op-eds from legitimate media outlets. And at the end of the semester, I did a sort of roundtable to talk about the experience, and the students, it really stunned me. They said, this is the first time we have felt safe, even in an academic setting, talking about some of these issues, because we're so afraid that we'll get labeled when we open our mouths, and then it'll become people dug into their point of view. And that's what kind of opened my eyes to this idea that it's a beautiful thing if we can listen to each other. And part of listening to each other is to have a framework for doing that and someone managing that. So that's really, again, lawyers can be combative, but the legal way of thinking builds in, take into account what we call policy, which is, why do we have the law to begin with? Why is murder banned? It's somewhere along the line, someone decided to make that law. Why? Because we value life. So there's a value embedded in the law. Why do we have speed limits? Well, because we value safety for pedestrians, and we want to have an environment where we can get in the car and feel like there's not chaos that could put us in the hospital. That's not the case in other parts of the world, where people just drive however they want. And so those are two of the fundamental tenets in the book. And then the last piece, as I mentioned earlier, is lawyers have to tell their clients news they don't want to hear. I can't do that for you. We're not going to win that argument. Or if you've gone through a bad divorce, you're not going to get everything you feel you deserve, and maybe you do deserve. And so it's that tolerance for giving some things up for the broader good that I'm also trying to start a dialogue about or with this book.
Well, let's get into the structure of this book. There are two different things that you break down into 5 parts. One is you're breaking into, I would say, dimensions of life. So chapters 1 through 5 go like this: thinking like a lawyer at work, thinking like a lawyer in family life decisions, thinking like a lawyer in civic life. And then chapter 4, thinking like a lawyer in healthcare decisions. Chapter 5, thinking like a lawyer in hiring a lawyer. I found it really interesting that you broke it down into those realms. So I'd love to hear about that. And after that, we can talk about your method, the BICAT method. But first of all, why these realms? Why did you choose these 5 different areas to concentrate on? Work, family life decisions, civic life, healthcare decisions, and hiring a lawyer.
I tried, and of course, close work with my editor on this, Sarah Nelson at Harper, who has been pivotal across the board with all these books. But the idea was, and as you know from reading the beginning, I do a little bit of sort of psychological, and scientific background on how we make decisions. And we've all been in that situation where we have to trust our instincts, where, the fight or flight response that comes from the amygdala, and we're flooded with hormones that are there for a good reason to make sure we make really good decisions in the moment. And that can be of vital importance and, in certain walks of life. But there are other times in our lives where decisions are much more nuanced and complicated, and they can feel very overwhelming. So those 5 areas, having gone through a very difficult divorce, I really wanted to talk about family life, because, not only am I a lawyer, but I'm a mother and went through that. And it really you feel flooded days on end and don't really know how to make sense of the chaos. So that was the family life. Thinking of a lawyer like a lawyer at work, that's one of the environments, I think, where particularly women, and I can't speak for all women, of course, but, it can be a fraught moment to ask for a raise. I mean, women don't get equal pay for equal work. And I think that's built into our structure and our social contract for worse. I wouldn't say at all for better. But how do you do that in a way that is coherent and takes the emotion out of it? Civic life, that's off of my last book. I just, I could have done the whole book about politics and voting and why it matters to care about our democracy and how to think about political issues, and how to have the conversation around the Thanksgiving table with people that don't agree with you around these really difficult issues. But sort of step back a little bit and say, how do you make a decision as to if you want to be more involved in how our civic world, including government, is functioning for you and your family? How do you even start that conversation for yourself? Healthcare, you mentioned, we'll talk about it. It's not only so difficult in terms of coverage and the financial burden, but these are hard decisions. I mean, do you have the elective surgery? I mean, how do you decide about end of life decisions? Life like law and law like life is rarely black and white. It's mostly gray, and lawyers are brought in to bring some order to the chaos. And then, the last piece is, okay, there's only so much you can do on your own, but how do you, when do you pull the trigger and hire a lawyer? And most of us will have that at some point in our lives. We'll need one for a will, or, heaven forbid, for if there was any criminal sort of dust up, or, I mentioned a divorce, or if you have some kind of contract conflict with an employer or with somebody that you've hired. All of these things at some point you might have to get professional legal counsel in. But the idea here is, okay, how do you even get to the point to decide to do that? And as you mentioned, I have this 5-part test and I have examples and worksheets that you could just pull it out and walk through it at the end. And even if it doesn't produce the answer, it'll make you feel like you have a little more control over the process.
We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. But when we return, I'll still be speaking with Kim Wehle about her book, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, and more specifically about the BICAT method, how to break down your decisions to help you make them.
As a lawyer, ever wish you could be in 2 places at once? You could take a call when you're in court, capture a lead during a meeting. That's where Posh comes in. We're live virtual receptionists who answer and transfer your calls so you never miss an opportunity. And the Posh app lets you control when your receptionist steps in. So if you can't answer, Posh can. And if you've got it, Posh is just a tap away. With Posh, you can save as much as 40% off your current service provider's rates. Start your free trial today at posh.com.
You're no stranger to compromise. You're a lawyer. But getting the legal team you need is a compromise you shouldn't have to make. Like when you have to invest in hiring a full-time generalist lawyer when you need a highly specialized IP counsel. Or when you don't want to bring in your external law firm with their partner-level price tag. Axiom can help you match the right legal resource to the right matter at the right cost for the right duration. No legal leader should compromise their high standards, and with Axiom, you don't have to. Learn more at axiomlaw.com/ABA.
In a world that's constantly changing, the law and how it's practiced must also evolve to keep up with those changes. The ABA Journal's Asked and Answered podcast dives into the compelling stories surrounding lawyers' personal and professional lives. I'm your host, Stephanie Francis Ward, and each month I bring on a new guest to explore their involvement with our dynamic legal ecosystem. For the stories that bring the law to life, follow the ABA Journal's Asked and Answered podcast, part of the Legal Talk Network.
The ABA Journal Legal Rebels podcast features the men and women in the legal profession who aren't satisfied with good enough. These are the people who are changing the way law is practiced and setting the standards that will define the profession in the future. Each episode, we share their story. To hear insights from those with an eye fixed towards tomorrow, follow the Legal Rebels podcast, part of the Legal Talk Network.
Welcome back to the Modern Law Library. I'm here speaking with Kim Wehle, author of How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why. So let's dig into the BICAT method. Could you please share what the 5 steps of the BICAT method are? And then maybe we can get into some hypotheticals and test this out.
Sure. So BICAT stands for break, identify, collect, argue, and tolerate. And the way the book is designed is that for each of those areas of life that we just talked about, I unveil the next step in the method. I do that first by explaining a legal case and how that step makes its way into law, and then I apply it to regular life. So step 1, break a problem down. So lawyers will take, you might say something like, I just got fired from my job, and I think it was discriminatory, for example. A lawyer will take something that generic, that big question, and break it down into particulars so that what were the terms of your contract? What are the sort of personal characteristics that potentially could give rise to a violation of laws protecting people from arbitrary discrimination? What kind of damages did you suffer? So a lawyer will go down automatically. I call this frameworks with my students. It's almost like a decision tree. And that way you can take off chunks of the problem, address the chunks, and then get back to the big issue, right? So you're not going right for the money shot. Should I win or should I not? A lot of sub issues. And so that's number 1. The lawyer will automatically do that. 2, I have is identify your values and your aim. As I said, we call this in law policy. Why do we have a ban on discrimination on the basis of race and gender, et cetera, in the Civil Rights Act? Before that, in the 1960s, it was perfectly legal for private parties to discriminate that way against employees, for example. But we've decided as a society that's bad, right? So likewise, in the book, I said, before you make a big decision, rather than going on instinct and emotion, identify for yourself what matters. So if it's a decision, okay, do I allow my child to get a nose piercing? You can write down before you have that debate or conversation with your child, what matters to you when it comes to raising a child. I mean, it could be that sort of physical appearance and adherence to traditional values in that way is absolutely optimal. The healthcare implications, maybe that's important, but maybe sort of, enabling independence and decision-making for the child and maybe making some mistakes. If you identify that early on, then I think the conversation with your child is going to be a little more focused and perhaps less reactive. So that's number two. And we all have our values, Lee. We don't need lawyers to tell us that. We don't write them down very often. But more broadly, it could be integrity, honesty, hard work, professionalism, whatever it is in your family. I mean, mine are very particular with my kids. I lay them out. This is how we do things. We act with integrity, period, for example. 3 is C. So we have break it down, identify your values and your aim. C is collect lots of knowledge. And the book does a little bit on how in the internet, the internet age, how do you separate good information from bad information? I was raised in an environment where, we had to go to the public library and pull up, the little 3x5 cards. It was hard to find information. That was the challenge, right? You start with an encyclopedia, but to get follow-up, backup, you'd have to, go to find a book, and sometimes the book had to be borrowed. It was not easy. If you want original source materials, you had to go to a microfiche. Really difficult. Now it's the opposite. We're overwhelmed. So the skill we need to develop for the 21st century, in part, is how do you get at the best kinds of information? So I talk about that. But lawyers this is what we call discovery in the civil litigation process. Prosecutors do it in the criminal context. Just get a lot of information up on the table. Number 4 is argue both sides. This surprises students. They think they see TV, they're like, I'm going to argue for my client. But in order to argue for your client, you have to have outlined the counter arguments. You have to know where the potholes are. And we're not really good at that in our culture lately. We're not so good at sort of slowing down and really thinking about what the other person is saying and the value in that and how it counteracts your own position. Lawyers have to do that or they'll lose in court because they'll get blindsided. And the last one is tolerate. Tolerate the fact that people will disagree with your choice and that you might feel conflicted. Lawyers have to give their clients bad information. We're not going to get that dollar figure for you, even if we win across the board. Or, we have really strong arguments, but this judge, it can be a little fickle. It's hard to predict, and any lawyer will tell you juries do different things than you expect. So lawyers understand they're not going to win 100%, and they might lose even if the merits of their case mean they should have won. That's baked into the profession. But as I talk about in the book, if you've identified your values, even if you lose, you don't get everything you want, you can still say, well, I adhered to what mattered to me. I adhered to my values. You could say, listen, it's so important to me to just wrap up this litigation as quickly as possible and not drag it out. Imagine a divorce situation. For me, it's more important to move on than to get the house 100% for myself. If you've identified that early, then when you're sitting down in a negotiation with your partner, your former spouse, and you realize, okay, I really should have gotten a higher dollar figure, but guess what? This is going to wrap up today. You can walk away feeling like you had a win, even though you might not have gotten everything you wanted. And the argument I made in the book and the framework is, let's do this on a step-by-step basis. And at the end of the day, you can feel better about your decision because it was methodical, it was thought out, it was based on facts, it adhered to your own value system. So that's how I got the 5-step method.
You didn't address the COVID-19 pandemic super directly in your book, but I certainly thought about all of the incredibly fraught decisions we've all been called upon to make in the past 2 years. Everything from are we going to get together for Thanksgiving? To should I send my child to school this year? Should I wait in hopes that, maybe next year it won't be remote? Or so many areas in our life where, most of us are not experts in epidemiology and infectious disease. And I think many people have felt very unprepared to make some of these decisions. You and I are speaking on February 17th in 2022. And one of the conversations we've been having nationally has been about masking in schools. And so I thought that might be an opportunity for us to take a look at, how, let's say you're a parent, you're deciding, would I send my child to a school that doesn't require masking? Or, do I take masking into account when I think about schooling? How would you suggest a parent, and you certainly are a parent, sit down and start thinking about school in the era of COVID?
That's a great question. And so, you're putting me on the spot, which I'm delighted to do, right? I haven't actually applied my boycott method to this question. So let's see if it works, right?
Right.
So let me just say, back to the reason I wrote the book, one way of doing that, of answering that, and I'm not suggesting people did this, but one way of answering that we see in what other walks of life is saying, oh, well, this political party says to do this with masks. That political party says to do that with masks. I'm going to go with my team, right? And once I go with my team, I'm invested in the outcome, go Mets or whatever, that's my team. And I'm going to cling to that. I'm going to hang on to that. I mean, cling isn't a great word, but I'm invested in that because I believe in the team. That's one way to do it. And, that can be helpful, but for something this important, I think it's not, right? Because the people that are, one way or the other making those proclamations or urging people to act one way, wear a mask or not wear a mask, don't necessarily have the same considerations and values and concerns that you do for your family and your children. Politicians care about their own power. I don't care where they are on the political spectrum. That's a little bit different from, the education and the well-being of your child, right? So I would say step one is take a deep breath and don't go there. And I talk about in the book how, it takes science says it takes 20 to 30 minutes for the fight or flight hormones to rush out of your body. So if you're feeling agitated about something in a decision, take a break, literally walk around the block, do something for 30 minutes and come back. Same thing if you're having an argument with someone that's escalating, 30 minutes, come back. So if we say break the problem down, okay, so that would mean identify the various elements of the problem. Health, the health of my child, right? So don't want them to get COVID. The education of my child. Well, don't want them to get COVID, but, academically, Zoom is not great. It can be academics and also the social development of my child. That might be three. I'll just use those as examples. So we've broken the problem down. It's not any longer, do we wear masks or not? It's health, education, social development. Number two, identify your values and your aim. Now, so for health, for example, one parent might say, they cannot get a virus no matter what because they have other preconditions. Or it can be, listen, I've worked so hard for my child's health. I'm really careful about it. It's something that really matters to me. I'm very careful about the diet. They take vitamins. I'm, buckle up seatbelts, wear helmets, in a stroller, whatever it is, right? That's so important to me and my family. Totally respect that. But you can put that down, longevity, social. So something like social development. What matters to you there? Independence, having a lot of friends, whatever it is. You could break that down. And then I say in the book, circle the one that matters to you the most. Just circle it. I mean, for me, for my children, it is the overwhelming value is they need to act with integrity. And number two, as a parent, I feel like my job is to launch them into adulthood. And sometimes that means they have to take some risks. That's just me personally, right? But another value could be, but I also want to respect the community. That's important to me because I live in it. So that's number two. Three is collect lots of knowledge, okay?
And just to break in, I love that what you're showing as you break these down is you're not trying to get everyone to get to one singular answer. You're showing them how they can make an answer that makes sense for their individual circumstances.
Exactly. And that's empowering, right? Just like it's empowering to belong to a team, I'm offering a different way of empowering, which is a skill for breaking something down for yourself. And then you might end up on the same team at the end. But it's the power is in your own knowledge and your own skill set to do that for yourself rather than glomming on or joining a team, which sometimes is great. But absolutely, I don't, whatever the outcome is, I don't have a personal view. But I do have a personal view in empowering people to make the decision for themselves. Collect lots of knowledge. I mean, you mentioned people don't know what to believe. So I talk about in the book, right? I mean, you want to look to sources, the source of information, what do they base it on? And, if it's a medical study, the beauty of the internet age, you can pull up the medical study. I talk about in the book, get the original source yourself and read it. Don't listen to Kim Wehle on CNN talking about an indictment. Read it. You can get that now. It's great, right? Put all of that information up on the table. And then I also talk about how to make sure it's verified and valid information. I mean, when you're talking about healthcare, you really, this is why we go get second opinions. You want good information when it comes to something that important, right? You don't want a dentist doing heart surgery. You just, we can agree on some limitations around that. 4 is argue both sides. This is your typical pros and cons list, but now you're doing it in a much more informed way. You go back to how you've broken the problem down and you identify for yourself, okay, here are all the reasons to send my kid to a place where masks are mandatory. And, it might turn out that it's because you really want them in a social environment and you want them in the classroom with professionals. That's more important to you than maybe you believe from a sort of a political standpoint that government should be making those decisions. Maybe you do. Maybe that's one of your values. Maybe that's one of the elements of breaking it down, but you've decided, okay, that's fine. But I really, really, what matters to me the most is that my kid get around other kids. So you might argue both sides there. And then the last one, number 5, is tolerate that people will disagree with your choice and you might feel conflicted. You're going to have to give some stuff up. Whatever you broke down in number 1, you're going to have to make some compromises, but you're doing it in a very methodical way. You're doing it in eyes wide open way with information that matters, that is good information, and having identified your value system. So as I said, in the end, say you're a person that just really, really has a problem with public education. You always have with public school education. You really want to be primarily responsible for your children's education. That might require sacrifices on your part. You've got to get up to speed on, algebra, not my thing anymore, right? You might have to cut back in other parts of your life because you've decided you just don't really want the school making these decisions for you. So you're going to have to give some other stuff up, and you might have people judge you. Okay. Or likewise, you might be in an environment where, your friends and family are really against any type of masking or vaccines. And you've decided for your own family, listen, I value my child being in the educational setting. And so if you can say to yourself, listen, that's my value. So people can be mad at me, but I know for myself, based on what happened under step 2, that this is what matters to me. So I can live with this decision. There you go. Boom. We just did it in real time.
We sure did. Kim, thank you so much for joining us and talking through the BICAT method. If people want to go and pick up your book and read it for themselves, and there are some good diagrams in there, I really do suggest you pick up a copy, but where can they do that?
I have a website, www.kimwehle.com, but Wehle, and I tweet at Kim Wehle, and I have an Instagram account at Kim Wehle. I do a show called Simple Politics where I break down issues that are complicated across the board. But you can really, honestly, Lee, you can buy it anywhere. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's all over the place. If you just type in Wehle, there aren't many of us, and a lot of options will come up for you. Or you could buy it at your local bookstore, which I'm all about.
Great. And this is the meanest possible question to ask someone whose book just came out. What will be yesterday when people are listening to this? What's your next project?
It's actually not such a mean question. I have another one in the works already. It's with a different publisher, but it's going to be about what started this whole journey, the pardon power, the president's pardon power. It's kind of this black hole that is considered sort of, unlimited. And I break it down. It's going to be really interesting. Talk about the Bible, talk about, the origins of it in common law England and how it's translated into popular culture and into the law today. So it's super fun. It's going to be, the coffee table book for people to start, again, owning this issue for themselves and making their own determination when the pardons come around inevitably at the end of every presidency. And even more so, governors do it. More people are in state and local prisons than in federal prison. And so it's much misunderstood. So that's the next project. It's already in the works.
I'll look forward to that one for sure. And thank you again to Kim Wehle, author of the book, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why. And thank you to my listeners. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Modern Law Library, please rate, review, and subscribe in your favorite podcast listening service. And if you've read a book that you'd like me to check out, you can always email me at books@abajournal.com.